Mesoderm derivatives. We have learned earlier that mesoderm is going to form some of the tubes, like we have mentioned the cardiovascular tube is coming from the mesoderm. Then we also talked about the upper portion of the genitourinary system, that is the kidney, testis, ovaries. They are coming from the mesoderm. Mesoderm is also going to divide into certain parts. We can discuss like in the axis we were having axial mesoderm. This axial mesoderm or notochord is important for stimulation of the overlying ectoderm to form nervous system. Otherwise, after that, it is simply degenerating. It is going to form nucleus pulposus of the intervertebral disc. Then on the side of the axial mesoderm, you have paraxial mesoderm. Paraxial mesoderm form the somite, and somite will divide into three tomes on right and left side. So what are the three tomes? There'll be a middlemost sclerotome, then in the middle we have myotome, laterally we have dermatome. Dermatome, which is lateral, form the skin dermis, especially at the back region, and in the middle we have myotome forming muscles, the skeletal muscles, and in the medialmost is half of the vertebra developing on right side, half of the developing on the left side, the sclerotome forming the vertebra which will fuse in the midline to enclose the neural tube, basically spinal cord protection. So in the diagram we'll see that. If you go still more lateral, there will be the intermediate mesoderm. Intermediate mesoderm is the one which form major portion of genitourinary system. Kidney, testis, ovaries come from here. If you go still lateral, there will be a third cavity developing, though it is a single cavity, but since we have taken a section like this, it appears like two cavities. That is the third cavity, the coelomic cavity, intra-embryonic coelomic cavity. There is one dorsal cavity, amniotic cavity, ventral yolk sac cavity. This is the third cavity, and it is dividing the lateral plate mesoderm into two parts. So what is lateral plate mesoderm giving? That also we have to discuss. Let us draw a diagram for this, and then we can look at the various derivatives as well. And this is the transverse section of the embryo, once again showing the three germ layer after gastrulation, and this time we are focusing upon the mesoderm. In the mesoderm, we are telling we are having this axial mesoderm, which is also called as the notochord, and this notochord or the axial mesoderm is going to give us some of the derivatives, like it is giving us nucleus pulposus of the intervertebral disc. So nucleus pulposus of the intervertebral disc, we understand that if these are the two vertebrae, in between you have intervertebral disc. In the intervertebral disc, we are having a central portion, that is the nucleus pulposus coming from the notochord. Then on the side of the axial mesoderm, you have paraxial mesoderm. As you say, this is the paraxial mesoderm. It is the paraxial mesoderm which is going to give us the somite. So this is the paraxial mesoderm on the side of the axial mesoderm, and is going to give us the somites. And somite actually itself divides into three parts. We call them as tome. Like the middlemost is the sclerotome, then in the middle we have myotome, and laterally we have the dermatome. We will be talking about these tomes in detail, but here you can just mention the middlemost sclerotome is going to form half of the vertebra, and not only it is going to form the vertebra, it is also forming the ribs which are attaching to the vertebra. So vertebra and ribs, they come from the sclerotome part of the somite, or it is the paraxial mesoderm. So what about the myotome? Myotome is going to form the muscles, as the name is suggesting. The skeletal muscles of our body develop from the myotome, part of the somite, part of the paraxial mesoderm. Whereas if we are focusing upon the dermatome, dermatome is forming the dermis, the skin dermis. But be careful, the skin dermis is on the back region, like covering erector spinae. So as we have the erector spinae muscle on the back region, we are having a skin over that paraxial. Paraxial. The name is telling paraxial. So it is covering the skin which is paraxial on the back region. Now we will be focusing upon these tomes in a separate diagram, but let us come back in this region, and we have learned that we are going to have one intermediate mesoderm also. So this is going to be the intermediate mesoderm, and intermediate mesoderm is forming the major portion of the genitourinary system. That means it will have some derivatives like kidney, testis, ovaries. Now, when you are telling the kidney, testis, ovaries, the major portion of the genitourinary system, it is the upper part, because lower part we have known it is coming from endoderm of the hind gut. And be careful that the genitourinary system will have some smooth muscles. So those smooth muscles also will be coming from the intermediate mesoderm. For example, the urinary bladder has a detrusor muscle. So detrusor of the urinary bladder is actually coming from the intermediate mesoderm, despite the fact that itself the epithelium may come from the endoderm of the hind gut. So understand that we are telling muscles of the genitourinary system, especially smooth muscles, they'll all come from the intermediate mesoderm. Then as we proceed further, there is a lateral plate mesoderm also. So when we are talking about the lateral plate mesoderm, which we are showing now here, say this is the lateral plate mesoderm, or that is the lateral plate mesoderm. But then we have a third cavity developing. Dorsally we have the amniotic cavity, ventrally we have yolk sac cavity, and a third cavity was developing, and we were calling it as the coelomic cavity. So now I am showing the coelomic cavity, and this coelomic cavity which developed laterally, maybe as you can see on the right side or maybe on the left side. So the coelomic cavity itself is going to give us three more cavities. We have learned the pericardial, pleural and peritoneal cavity. Now let us say that this is the coelomic cavity giving us, maybe this could be the pericardial cavity, the pleural cavity or peritoneal cavity. This is the cavity. Coelomic cavity giving any of the three. Now these cavities, they'll have the viscera, and that viscera will be covered by the layers. Like you can say it is the viscera which is covered by visceral layer of pericardium if you're talking about the heart, the pleura if you're talking about the lungs, and peritoneum if you're talking about the gut. But then on the outside you will find that there is the parietal layer. So in the periphery we have the parietal layer. So parietal layer of that could be pericardium or pleura or peritoneum. If you are talking about the outside, that is the parietal layer, and if you are talking about the inside, then it is the visceral layer. Where are these layers coming from? We are telling that there is a dorsal cavity, amniotic cavity, ventral is the yolk sac cavity. A third cavity has developed, which is called as the coelomic cavity, dividing the lateral plate mesoderm. And this coelomic cavity actually is one in number, but it is appearing in this section on the right and left side, is the one which will form three cavities, which are the pericardial, pleural or peritoneal cavity. But these cavities will have viscera, and the viscera will be covered by some membranes. Where is the visceral layer of the pericardium, pleura, peritoneum coming from? Or where is the parietal, peripheral layer of the pericardium, pleura, peritoneum coming from? They come from the lateral plate mesoderm covering the cavity. Actually, lateral plate mesoderm will be divided into two parts now, which you can mention. You will see there is a dorsal somatic. There is a dorsal somatic portion of the lateral plate mesoderm, and then you can mention there is a ventral visceral. This is going to be the ventral and visceral lateral plate mesoderm. As you can understand, the one which is towards the yolk sac is considered as visceral. So this portion of the lateral plate mesoderm towards the yolk sac is called as ventral visceral lateral plate mesoderm, and the one which is towards the amniotic cavity towards the ectoderm is called as the dorsal somatic lateral plate mesoderm. So it is obvious now. It is the dorsal somatic lateral plate mesoderm which is going to form the parietal layers. But if you are talking about ventral visceral, it will form the visceral layer of the pericardium, pleura, peritoneum. See, understand here. We are talking about the coelomic cavity, parietal layers and visceral layers. Coelomic cavity, the parietal layers will come from the dorsal somatic lateral plate mesoderm. But coelomic cavity, the visceral layer will come from ventral visceral lateral plate mesoderm. But that is about the cavity and the layers. What are the other derivatives of lateral plate mesoderm. You will see there are some other derivatives which we have to remember, and you can remember this one now. Ventral, visceral, lateral plate mesoderm give us the visceral muscles. When you say it is giving the visceral muscles could be the cardiac muscle or it could be the smooth muscles. And remember, most of the visceral muscles, maybe it is the cardiac muscle or maybe it is the smooth muscle, they come from here. Ventral, visceral, lateral plate mesoderm giving us visceral muscles like cardiac muscles, smooth muscles, but there are some exceptions like we have told. If you're talking about the smooth muscles of the genitourinary system, then genitourinary system, the smooth muscles, they were coming from the intermediate mesoderm. Exceptions become questions. So we are telling smooth muscles in most of the body, cardiac muscles, they will come from the ventral, visceral, lateral plate mesoderm. But there are some exceptions like the intermediate mesoderm forming the smooth muscles or specifically genitourinary system. For example, the detrusor muscle of urinary bladder will come from this region, intermediate mesoderm. Then what is the dorsal somatic lateral plate mesoderm giving? Additionally, the dorsal somatic lateral plate mesoderm is giving us some derivatives which you can mention here, and they are upper limb bones and the lower limb bones called as appendicular skeleton. Now when you are talking about the appendicular skeleton, that means the upper limb and the lower limb bone. That could be the humerus bone or the femur bone. All these bones, they are coming from this is appendicular skeleton, and this appendicular skeleton is coming from dorsal somatic lateral plate mesoderm. Now you have learnt about the upper limb, lower limb bones coming from here. You have learnt about the somite, which was having three parts. We have discussed somite will have three parts, and it was the myotome, the dermatome, and the sclerotome. And then we have mentioned that the sclerotome part was forming vertebra and the ribs. Vertebra and the ribs. What about the sternum? Where the sternum will come from? Vertebra and the ribs, they are coming from sclerotome, part of the somite, which is the middlemost. Where the sternum will come from? Sternum actually come from dorsal somatic lateral plate mesoderm. So not only it form upper limb, lower limb bone, but will also form the sternum. Now why all this is important? Because examiner already have asked about the rib development. Now next they may be asking about the sternum or upper limb, lower limb. So they are developing here. Let us look at the skeleton of the body and discuss where all bones are developing from. It is kind of a revision then. And we have just mentioned maybe it is the upper limb bones or maybe it is the lower limb bones. We are considering it as the appendicular skeleton. So this appendicular skeleton is coming from what we are telling. It is the dorsal somatic lateral plate mesoderm, and this dorsal somatic lateral plate mesoderm is also giving us the sternum. We have mentioned this sternum is also coming from the dorsal somatic lateral plate mesoderm. Whereas if we talk about the ribs or we are talking about the vertebra, so where is this rib and the vertebra coming from? We have told they are on the side, paraxial. They are coming from the paraxial mesoderm. Actually, paraxial mesoderm will be forming the somite, and somite will have one medial component, and that medial component was the sclerotome. So it is the sclerotome which is going to form the ribs and the vertebra. Then what about the most of the skull bones? We have discussed that when we are talking about the skull bones, most of the skull bones, they are coming from neural crest cell derived secondary mesenchyme. So when we are talking about the anterolateral aspect, most of the skull bones, they are coming from the neural crest cell derived secondary mesenchyme, but minus the posterior occipital bone because that is primary mesoderm, and that and along with the vertebra, it is all coming from paraxial mesoderm, primary mesoderm. So here we have learned some of the bones developing from the mesoderm. Now, this skeletal portion of the somite we have discussed, but let us look at the other components as well. As we mentioned, that there will be the somite, which is a paraxial mesoderm developing on the sides of the axial mesoderm, the notochord. So notochord is the axial mesoderm, on the side is paraxial mesoderm, and it was forming the somite. Somite will have three components. Middlemost on either side is the sclerotome, and then in the middle we have the myotome, and lateral is the dermatome. We have told dermatome is going to form the skin dermis, especially the paraxial skin covering the erector spinae on the back. So skin dermis. It is forming the skin dermis, the dermatome. Middle is the myotome, and will form all the skeletal muscle in our body. All the skeletal muscle in our body come from the myotome, which is paraxial mesoderm, forming somite, forming the myotome. But if you are talking about middlemost sclerotome, we have told half of the vertebra develop on one side, half of the vertebra develop on other side, and vertebra, they come from the sclerotome once they fuse. Now, it may happen that there's an open neural tube defect, means the spinal cord is open. If there is a spinal cord open, then the vertebra is also open, which is called as spina bifida. So the two sides of the vertebra, they could not fuse because the spinal cord itself was open neural tube defect. See, normally what we have is the neural plate ectoderm forming neural tube forming the spinal cord, and spinal cord is then protected by the vertebra, which came from the sclerotome. But if there is an open neural tube defect, the vertebra will also be open, which is called as spina bifida defect. And these days they are giving you such diagrams, which is a scanning electron microscope, and it is talking about the various layers of the mesoderm. You know, this is the notochord. We have seen one diagram earlier also. Notochord is going to stimulate the overlying ectoderm so that it forms neural plate and neural tube. Ectoderm. Neural tube will then form central nervous system, for example, the spinal cord. But then spinal cord is to be protected by vertebra, where the vertebra will develop from. This is the notochord, the axial mesoderm. On the side is paraxial mesoderm. So this is the paraxial mesoderm, and paraxial mesoderm will be forming half of vertebra here, half of vertebra there. If the neural tube is open neural tube defect, you'll find there is an open vertebra also, which is called as spina bifida defect. Then you have known that paraxial mesoderm was forming somite. Somite was having three components. Medial was the sclerotome, which will form the vertebra and the ribs, but the middle was the myotome, and the middle myotome formed the skeletal muscle of the body. Then laterally you have dermatome, which will form the skin dermis, and the skin dermis covering erector spinae muscle. Now this is the neural tissue. What is over that which is covering it now is the surface ectoderm. Surface ectoderm fuses in the midline as the neural tissue detaches from the dorsal side, and surface ectoderm was then forming skin epithelium. So surface ectoderm forms skin epithelium, neuroectoderm form the nervous system, basically central nervous system. This is axial mesoderm, this is paraxial mesoderm. Where is the intermediate mesoderm? If you talk about intermediate mesoderm, this is going to be intermediate mesoderm, the one which is forming major portion of genitourinary system. That could be kidney, testis, or the ovary, because that is where you have lateral plate mesoderm now. So if this is the lateral plate mesoderm, what is this cavity? There are three cavities in our body. Dorsally we have amniotic cavity, ventrally we have yolk sac cavity, and the third cavity is called as coelomic cavity. It is the intra-embryonic coelomic cavity. Dividing the lateral plate mesoderm into two parts, there will be a dorsal somatic portion towards the amniotic cavity and a ventral visceral portion towards the yolk sac cavity. And it was the ventral visceral lateral plate mesoderm which will form visceral layers of pericardium, pleura, and peritoneum, covering the cavities which could be pericardial cavity, pleural, or peritoneal cavity. Whereas the dorsal somatic layer will be forming the parietal layers of pericardium, pleura, or peritoneum, covering the cavity from the outside. Dorsal somatic lateral plate mesoderm will also form upper limb bone, lower limb bone, and the sternum bone. Whereas ventral visceral lateral plate mesoderm, it was contributing to visceral muscles like cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, but it is not forming smooth muscle of the genitourinary system because it is the intermediate mesoderm which will be forming the smooth muscles of genitourinary system. For example, detrusor muscle of the urinary bladder.